Hello YouTube and welcome back. This is our third or fourth build, depending on how you look at it, of the 1.1 patch. We had an idea of playing something with Electrify, and I knew that going into patch 1.1, playing something with Healing Hands, now that it's been nerfed, now that it's been bug fixed, now that it's been changed a little bit, I wanted to play Healing Hands because I do feel that during the 1.0 patch, Healing Hands was one of the sweetest additions to the game, and it was such a good skill, but it kind of got overshadowed by the fact that it generated 200,000 ward. So now that ward's been removed, we wanted to revisit Healing Hands, and someone in Twitch chat had the idea of using a Polaris new unique one-handed sword, which says two very important things. It's got some spell damage per attunement, spell damage per strength, melee damage per attunement. We're skipping that. We're not doing spell crit stuff. We're doing Electrify, and it says chance to cast Smite on melee hit, and chance to cast Smite at 2 additional enemies when you cast it directly. Of course, this is very good for leveling. Of course, this is good for Warpath. There's all kinds of cool stuff you can do with this, including what the initial idea of this build was, which was to use Polaris and cast Smite directly and proc Healing Hands. But instead of allowing it to be spell Healing Hands, we were going to proc melee Healing Hands. So you'd cast a spell, proc melee Healing Hands, and there's a 36% chance that your melee Healing Hands would in turn cast another smite. So the idea was when you're playing an Electrify build, Healing Hands is good for Electrify, but it doesn't have conversion of ignite chance into Electrify or shock chance into Electrify. It has a more multiplier. It has a proliferation thing, which is really, really strong. But at the end of the day, Electrify strictly from Healing Hands I don't think is enough, and the real juice comes from Smite. So using Polaris was a good idea to try to get as much Smite into the build as possible. So that was where the build began, and we're going to talk all about Sentinels, we're going to talk about Smite, we're going to talk about unique items that are oppressively strong and I don't like them, and then we're going to talk about like DPS thresholds and defenses, because that's very important as well. So, of course, the gear that you see on the screen right now and the gear that you saw in the very beginning of this clip or this video does not include the Polaris one-handed sword, because unfortunately, no matter how cool that idea was, the other one-handed sword for Electrify, it says Aurelius. It's been in the game for a while. It has up to 84% penetration with Electrify. And it's really hard to beat that. Even if you have cool ideas of Smite proccing melee attacks, proccing more Smites, and double casting things at range to help you clear, you can't really get around the fact that Aurelius basically has 84% more damage on it. And that's a really big number. And I don't want to use an Aurelius. I want to use this other thing. But it's just a better choice to be using this instead, and then have all of your damage happening at range instead of some of your damage happening not at range. Important for boss fights as well. You'd like to fight the bosses at any range possible instead of needing to be on top of them to proc the melee hit, to proc additional smites, to juice up your DPS. And it's just not worth it in terms of playstyle and in terms of DPS output. The other thing that I want to say is we got a good framework for this build coming from Dread. Dread, of course, played a dual wield Electrify Smite Paladin build to breeze through corruption at the very beginning of the 1.0 patch, and I loved it. I didn't really have an excuse to play the build because it was good, it existed, there was nothing really new with it. But now that we had Polaris, this other one-handed sword, it gave me an excuse to kind of deep dive into the character and learn more about how squishy it was, how tanky it could be, how the DPS was, how the clear was, and all those kinds of things. And what I've learned is that in the 1.1 patch, with the addition of the Harbingers, which you'd like to be fighting as often as possible, so that you can get a Harbinger's Eye, so that you can fight Aberoth, so that you can farm more cool endgame unique items, you need more single target damage. And the single target damage for this build was not high enough to justify how squishy it was while dual wielding. And then if you stop dual wielding and you use a shield instead, the DPS was not high enough to, the DPS wasn't high enough to justify not dual wielding. So you want to be dual wielding in terms of damage, but you also want a shield because you're so squishy, and no matter how many cool unique items you're using that say less damage taken, Sentinel is, at the end of the day, the class with the lowest ceiling for defenses. Someday this won't be the case. I hope. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this character here. We are dual wielding, and there's a couple neat and interesting things that we can say before we, go into gear mastery, skills and all that nonsense. And the first thing is, I think Seed of Echidrosil is an amazing helmet. I think this helmet is underutilized right now. I want to see more people use it, and until Sentinel gets revamped and gets relevant defenses, until that point, or maybe even up until that point and after that point, Seed is awesome. And it gives you a way to turn all that mana generation from like gain mana when you use Rive and hit an enemy, gain mana when you directly cast Smite, like on my helmet here, or gain mana when you use Vengeance and hit an enemy, gain mana when you do these, like when you can gain mana off of your 0 mana cost skill or your near 0 mana cost skill, it means that you have a way of refunding your mana and using your mana as another health pool. And it's really, really nice. Having like a little bit of ward and a little bit of damage taken from mana and a bunch of leech like this is a very, very good foundation for defense. It's not enough. Even with a shield, it's not enough. Maybe if your damage was 5 times as big. But it's a very, very good addition to the game, and I completely am in love with it. We're also using a Twisted Heart along with Wall of Nothing, which is just like another S tier addition to the game. It allows you to turn your health and your endurance threshold into these other things. We weren't building much endurance threshold in our Sigils of Hope, but you could revamp this build and use it as a outline for a different build. You can go endurance threshold here. You can go endurance threshold in your mastery, in the paladin stuff, and use that to fuel up more stuff with Wall of Nothing. Like, it's just, these unique items are so good, and even they can't see why EHG doesn't put defenses in the Sentinel skill trees. So that's that. Another key takeaway for my experience playing this character is that Orion Sunseal is way better quality of life than I was anticipating. Not having to have sigils on your bar means that you're allowed to run Rebuke on your bar, which is really convenient, having an unspec Rebuke. It also means, like, we only have like maybe we have like 60 or 70% uptime of 3 sigils, and then we have like 30 to 40% uptime of 4 sigils. So most of the time, like 3/4 of the time, we're only on 3 instead of 4. And honestly, that kind of feels okay. I could see a world in which I want to spend these points to get +1 sigil. It's just so that I oscillate between 5 and 4 instead of oscillating between 4 and 3. That'd be an option as well. But Orion Sunseal has overperformed in how much I want this on every Sentinel build that I play. So getting this with 2 or 3 LP is fairly common. Getting some damage affixes, some percent increased armor, even healing effect is relevant. So I love the addition of this to the game. And just like having more unspec skills like Rebuke is more player expression, and I like these things as well. So another thing that we want to touch on before we go a deep dive is our DPS while dual wielding on the dummy. Our peak DPS is about 1 million on a non-boss dummy. But I wanted to show you a 3 non-boss dummy over here. And I want to show you how quickly the damage ramps up. Because you might ask yourself, like, okay, well, what if you played this as Bleed? What if you played this as Ignite instead? And I said that a lot of the damage from Electrify comes from Smite, because Smite has Ignite to Electrify chance conversion and allows you to get things like Malin's Hubris, things like these nodes that give you a bunch of extra Ignite chance converted into Electrify. Because just with Healing Hands, you get 1 Electrify stack, and that's it. So it doesn't have much, even though it has a more damage multiplier over here. But of course, Holy Winds is one of the reasons that this build is interesting in terms of damage, and that is when you're clearing packs of enemies, or sometimes, like at the very beginning of the Aberoth fight, when there's 2 bosses standing next to each other, you ramp up damage really, really quickly because of how it normalizes the stacks between 2 enemies. If you have 10 stacks on one enemy and 10 stacks on the other enemy, they pass to each other, and then it goes 20 stacks on both. So something like this, if we pop our damage, you'll see that the damage ramps up to 1 million really, really quickly. And that's just like 1 million damage ticks on the dummy. So if you're having multiple bosses standing next to each other, it's awesome. So our peak DPS dual wielding is 1 million, but we also are spec'd into cast speed and tier 7 cast speed and tier 7 cast speed. And the reason I'm calling it the cast speed is, if we're spec'd into cast speed and that's where our damage comes from, it means that every time that we have to stop and move and we can't just hold on right click, means we're losing out on a lot of that damage. So things like Aberoth reward you for being able to either burst really hard or have damage ticking all the time. But we don't really do either of those two things. So something like Thonic Fissure Warlock, something like the new Witchfire builds that people are messing around with on Warlock as well, they have less damage than me at peak values, but they have substantially more consistent damage uptime, and they can just walk around and maneuver things and maneuver around enemies instead. So either having much more burst or maybe a little bit less damage, but more consistent application of damage would be something that I'm looking for in the future from a different build that I played. So we talked about some cool defensive items. We talked about, oh, I guess here's another one. We'll talk about this in the gear section as well. But I found that having no leech in the build at all was sufficient for a while, because I wanted to experiment with this node, Time and Faith, which just got changed in the patch 1.1. It has percentage of missing health when you use one of these skills, including Smite. And of course, percentage of missing health regained works very well with Twisted Heart. So having no leech in the build at all, of course, when you're standing on top of an enemy and your Smite's healing you, it's no big deal because you're always getting healed. But if you're standing at range, for example, and you're not getting healed from it, I can show you what my health looks like. My health goes down and it kind of stabilizes around 50% because I'm sacrificing health, and then I'm also recovering 10% of missing health whenever I cast my thing here. So we tried to play with no leech at all because I wanted to use Nihilus, but realistically, Bleeding Heart was something that we had to include in order to stay topped off and make use of our hybrid or tribrid defense with the damage taken from Mana Pool health as well. I think the last thing that I wanted to mention about this build before we go into the nitty gritty is armor applies to damage over time. I wanted to use a Malin's Hubris because I wanted more damage, because I wanted, to kill bosses before I fell asleep. So to do that, it means that I'm not using the normal pair of gloves, which is the Eternal Gauntlets. And the Eternal Gauntlets have that special line of text that says that your armor applies to your armor mitigation also applies to damage over time, the implicit modifier there. So having this and also having an explicit, a prefix that has that text on it, and maybe even using an Oracle's Amulet to mitigate damage over time, and maybe even going out of your way to take things like this, which say a percentage of your armor applied to damage over time per points of attunement, you really need some kind of damage over time mitigation. And this is feedback for people who want to play builds like this, but also to EHG. Why do shields exist? I don't know. So if you ask EHG, like, I don't have good defenses on a Sentinel, I feel squishy as a Sentinel, EHG will respond to you in a way that they responded to me in the past. They've said, well, Sentinels have good use of shields. As an aside, they've also said if VK builds use shields, that means that we've failed from a design perspective of building Void Knights, which is to say that Void Knights aren't supposed to use shields, so Void Knights have less defense, which means you're supposed to die. So just write that down. You're supposed to use a shield, and they say that Sentinels have a better time using a shield than other classes do, which is true because you have block chance in your mastery, unlike a Falconer. But you also have sigils giving you extra block chance here. So there's some truth and validity to having the easier time of using a shield on a Sentinel. But a shield notably does not solve damage over time, and damage over time is either massively overtuned, incoming damage over time that monsters deal to us, or we simply do not have enough ways to mitigate it. So one of my gripes with the Nihilus Unique Amulet is that it's so cool, and it's +2 to skills, and it's got more armor on it, and it's so strong, and I love the variability. It's got some low rolls and some high rolls, and sometimes it goes negative or positive. It really makes you want to farm up a good Nihilus and use it and slam it and put tier 7 LE dot on it. But first of all, I need leech, so I probably need a Bleeding Heart. And second of all, even if I weren't using a Bleeding Heart, I should probably just be using an Oracle Amulet instead, because an Oracle Amulet is better than a Nihilus, isn't it? Because it has Oracle Amulet, because it has up to 20% less damage over time taken. 20% less damage over time taken if I had these gloves here, let's say that 20% of armor dot, or of armor mitigation also applies to damage over time. If I have 60% armor here and 20% of it applies, that means 12. And an Oracle Amulet goes up to 20. And I'm still getting over the fact that Nihilus looks so good, but it might just be worse than a white item with a good implicit value, because that's how dangerous damage over time is in Last Epoch right now. So I'm still getting over that, and I'm not quite over it yet, but maybe I will be someday. So those are some of the broad speaking points about this build. Would I recommend this build to you? No, I wouldn't recommend it to you. It has okay clear speed, but nothing special. The single target damage is really nothing special. And the issue with defenses, even if you're using things like Static Shell gives you, either more damage or more armor, you can kind of swap this into your build as well. You have the Seed of Yggdrasil, which is awesome in terms of defense. Wall of Nothing plus Twisted Heart and Bleeding Heart to feed into this to keep you like nice and topped off to generate more ward. You could even use a shield, but then you have no damage. And then wait, damage. People like damage. So I would not recommend this build to you. Is the Crit Smite build better? Maybe. Crit Smite build would use a Devotion instead. You want to keep your mana nice and low. Maybe you go Mad Alchemist Ladle, perhaps. But then you would get a better source of leech elsewhere, and then that could fuel your Twisted Heart. I didn't want to play a Devotion Smite build because I felt that as soon as you start doing like Devotion, Smite, Crit stuff, you just use a Mad Alchemist Ladle. You probably don't use a Polaris at all. And I felt like if Polaris was going to have any room to shine in a build like this, it's probably going to be Electrify. So I only experimented with the Electrify version of this. Wouldn't really recommend it. It was fine. It was fun for a while, but I think there's just even outside of the realm of bugged builds, which there are many, there's just better choices than this. So I don't think I'd recommend it. Okay, let's go over skills real quick so you can see what I opted into and what my thinking was, and then we'll go over mastery and gear too. First up, let's talk about Smite right here in the middle. We're at Electrify build. We took all the nodes right here on the right side. We sometimes we use a wand, sometimes we don't use a wand. When we don't use a wand, our mana cost is 8. When we do use a wand of a -4, our mana cost goes down to 4. But remember, we're automatically getting 10 mana back from this. And then you don't need this helmet, but it's cool, and I love it. I just wish the defenses were better elsewhere too. So that's what our mana looks like. We're grabbing all these nodes over here. We grab some extra double cast nodes. If you don't have plus levels, I would trim 1 point out of this, or maybe 1 point out of the Ignite chance over here. The Ignite chance gets converted to Electrify. This is 20 Electrify per point, and this is 25 Electrify per point. So if you have extra points, it can go in here instead. We're healing ourselves enough that we don't need a last point in Attunement. For healing hands next, we want to have 4 points into Hand of Aurelius. If you want to do the Polaris stuff, where Spell Smite procs melee attack, procs Smite. If you want to do that, then you want to have Seraph Blade as well in the bottom right-hand corner to convert it to a melee attack. If you don't want to do the melee attack stuff, which is probably more of a gimmick than it is good, then simply do not take this node. You want 4 points here, 4 points into Holy Winds, and the some extra mana cost and area over here. Not much room for anything else. If you want to use it as a movement skill, go ahead and do that. I just happen not to like it. Sigils of Hope, we have 22 points here, and we were not taking Last Wish. I think it's really interesting that not needing Last Wish, or using Orion's Sunseal, allows you to not take Sigils on Kill, which feels like a brand new skill. Like, we only have 22 points, but I feel like I have 40 points, and I can just grab anything, because I no longer need to take this stupid point over here. So we have all 5 points into Ignite chance, which of course becomes Electrify, +1 sigil over here, and some extra block chance over there. To speak briefly about block chance, I'll remind you about this later, but if I do something like this, you'll see that I have, 89 and then 92 block chance when I have this. I would use a different shield if I were going to continue playing this build. I'd use like the Apocalypse shield, but we'll get to that later. Let's put some points back in here real quick. Doop doop. Whew. All right, Holy Aura, I'm going to save for the last because I think it's kind of fluff. Let's go Volatile Reversal first. It's still the best skill in the game. Love it or hate it. I guess if you hate it, just don't play the Sentinel, quite frankly. but Volatile Reversal gives us a tremendous amount of damage. Remember, it will give us cast speed, and it also hits twice on single target. When I say single target, I mean like you walk up here, you stand here for 1, 2, 3, and you go like that. And I didn't really move, but I clicked Volatile Reversal, and it hit twice. It hits twice, so it applies this 60% twice. So enemies take 120% more damage, and I get extra cast speed. Noteworthy, if you want more damage than I do, you would take nodes out of movement speed and you put them into Ancient Reversal. When you go back in time more, it means that sometimes with cooldown recovery speed or by killing bosses like this, you can stack this twice. So instead of enemies take 120% increased damage, enemies take 240% increased damage. So I don't like these nodes because I'm a scrub. But if you want more damage than me, you will take these nodes, you will use Volatile Reversal, and you'll like it. The last thing here is Holy Aura. We opted into Holy Aura instead of Javelin. Javelin, first of all, is a skill that I don't particularly enjoy. It's kind of clunky to use. Holy Aura has like better automation because I can just hold it down with my pinky or numlock it, either or. It also gives us haste and some extra resistances and stuff over here. It really doesn't do much. While we were a Polaris version of the build, we wanted as much cast speed as possible because we kind of want to cast 9 times per second, which ain't happening. But we want to cast 9 times per second in order to take advantage of this smite on melee hit. Realistically, that's kind of a pipe dream, but that was the thinking there. If you're not using Polaris, which we're not currently using Polaris, then the better choice is probably just to drop Holy Aura altogether and use Javelin to proc more smites on single target down over here. So just not using Holy Aura in a Paladin build, sure. Is this a good little breakpoint? So we talked about skills, but I think before we talk about mastery, let's talk about which mastery. If we're not using Holy Aura, which the best version of this build may not be, you don't really get much by being a paladin. You get judgment, okay. You get access to Reverence of Duality, sure, if you're taking it, I see it. You get 5% block chance. The top half of the paladin skill tree ain't much. So the other question is, well, if you're not paladin, what could you be? You could be a Void Knight, which you also get nothing up here because you can't echo, because in order to smite Electrify, you need to be taking this node for conversion. And if you take this for conversion instead, which converts smite to void, allowing it to be repeated with your bonus over here, then it no longer applies Electrify, and instead it applies slow, which ain't great. So if you want to play a Void Knight, the reason that you'd play it is not for the echo nodes, but rather instead for Anomaly. So what does Anomaly give you? Cast speed and leech. So it gives you 20 cast speed instead of 9, 18, 50-50, split the two. So Anomaly gives you a little bit, and then it gives you cooldowns. You can Volatile Reversal more often. It gives you some leech so that you can use Nihilus and not use Bleeding Heart like we talked about previously. But you're really not getting much. So what occurs to me is if you're playing Paladin and your skill tree sucks and you're not using Holy Aura, and you're not playing Void Knight because the skill tree sucks and the conversion sucks and you might not be using Anomaly, maybe you go Forge Guard, because the one thing that Forge Guard's got going for him, because I still have a pretty low opinion of Forge Guard, is that he really does have a lot of mitigation for damage over time. So I would try to get as much damage as possible. I would try to dual wield if I could. Maybe I take Walls of Solarum for just 1% less damage taken per point. I would do this and have some extra parry chance in my build, this Master of Arms node at the very top. I would get this Iron Attunement thing. I would take Liquid Iron for less damage over time taken. I would take all these nodes and just hope that it's good. So what that really means is that if Paladin does nothing for my build, and Void Knight does nothing for my build, and Forge Guard, even though he's pretty mediocre, still does very, very, very little for my build, it might be the case that Electrify simply doesn't have enough support in Last Epoch right now. This is the support for Electrify in Last Epoch right now. And that's about it. Maybe we should revisit this build once there are some more nodes or skills or items that have the word electrify on them, because it's very bare bones right now. It didn't occur to me that there is so little support across all the masteries. So that said, let's talk about the masteries and talk about what we did click. We are using a sword, so we're going to take the Blade Master node all the way at the top here for some extra cast speed. We have this Time and Faith node. It's got change for percent health missing gained when you directly cast Smite, which is sweet. We trimmed points out of Paladin. Pretty basic, boring skill tree here, because nothing helps our build, which is like life, block, life. We opted out of Reverence of Duality because I wanted to take some of these nodes and instead work into Smelter's Mites for this extra Ignite chance and Bleed chance, plus Malin's Hubris gets converted into Ignite, plus Smite, all of that Ignite chance gets converted into Electrify. And then we also wanted more damage over time mitigation. So ideally, I would have like 3 LP or at least 2 LP Malin's Hubris that has percentage of armor applies to damage over time mitigation. I didn't get it, but in some kind of an attempt to make that dream happen, I did take Iron Attunement here. Smite scales with Attunement, so it gives you 4% increased damage per point. It's got flat armor on it. Flat armor is always very nice. And even the mana is useful because we're technically playing a damage taken from mana build with the Seed helmet here. Void Knight, we're using a volatile reversal, so 5 points in Abyssal Endurance there. That's it might be the fastest overview of a mastery that I've ever done, but let's talk about gear real quick. I do think that Seed of Yggdrasil is like amazing for Sentinels in order to like build up a new layer of defenses, whether you're a ward build or a life build or a both build, just be hybrid, tribid, everything. So Seed with some kind of mana recovery on it, I love it. I'm going to try this in more builds in the future. You're either going to play with a static shell or with a wall of nothing for your body armor. You could try to incorporate a null perfusion, null's inclination. The null chest piece, whatever the null, you're going to make me go look it up, aren't you? The null portent item, it actually does give you overkill leech as health, which is not great for damage over time, but it gives you a little bit of extra leech, so maybe you can try that, then drop the bleeding heart, and then put Nihilus back on. But if you can get your resistances up to 115, then you could use that to be more damage mitigation for you. Because noteworthy that Wall of Nothing is 0 damage when hit, so it's only hit mitigation. All like the other defense for Wall of Nothing is just based on the ward stuff on it. But Null Portent, on the other hand, has up to 20% less damage taken, and it's not hits, it's anything. So it does help against dots. I guess real quick, it's even more important to note that, even though both Wall of Nothing and Null Portent are so good, the Champion Regalia that has 700 armor and it has armor mitigation applies to dot, that might still be better. And it's just another case of like damage over time is so dangerous that like, do I want to use this brand new unique item that only drops from the Pinnacle boss? Do I want to use this brand new unique item that has 20% DR on it? Do I want to use the Nihilist that's a new peak item that drops from the Pinnacle boss? Or do I want to use a white item that has damage over time mitigation? Who knows? For our weapon, we tried using a Polaris, but we opted into an Aurelius instead, because at the end of the day, this is really the only item in the game that supports Electrify, and it gives you basically 80% more damage and 2 levels to Smite. Ours has double tier 6 modifiers on it. We had a 3 LP Polaris that we were working on. We're trying to get Ignite on it, like Ignite, Lightning Penetration, percent damage over time, percent lightning damage, things like those. If you really wanted to juice up this build, which I would not recommend, that would be the kinds of things we're looking for. But I think the work of using Polaris is just not worth it at the end of the day. For our rings, we talked about Orion's Sun Seal, which is awesome. We have an Osirian, which gives us extra shock. It's actually our only source of shock in the build. Chill is great. We're using a unique weapon, so we don't want to put suffixes on it. We want to prioritize prefixes. We want to prioritize damage on it. So having shock and chill from an ocean ring, and then also having the more damage and less damage taken is awesome. So love this build, love including it. For our belts, just LE dots and some percent health or a cooldown recovery speed, some hybrid health. Those are the kinds of things you're looking for there. Of course, with cleanse as a prefix. Malin's Hubris. The primary reason for Malin's Hubris is not only for Smelter's Might in the Forge Guard skill tree, but it's also in our Blessings that we'll talk about in just a moment. Bleed on hit and Ignite on hit, both being converted to Ignite, both being converted into Electrify. The Citadel boots have reduced bonus damage taken from crits. This is our only crit mitigation that we have in the build. We also have a tiny bit of blind chance. Remember, blind is no longer useless in Last Epoch. In fact, it's quite good. So blinded enemies can't crit you at all. Citadel boots by themselves, if they were the only source of crit reduction, I would look for another source somewhere if you were playing this build in hardcore. This goes up to 50 at max roll, and then I have gloves here that go up to another 30, and like 80% crit reduction. I think 80% crit reduction, beautiful in hardcore. But you know, like maybe 40%, 50%, I would still be looking for another roll somewhere, even if I did have blind, which prevents enemies from critting. Our Twisted Heart has a bunch of cast speed on it. We could get plus levels to Smite on this instead if you wanted to juice up some extra damage nodes like this. I don't think that's worthwhile. I think just the cast speed was pretty good here, but maybe easing up on the tier 7 cast speed here and prioritizing some other kind of defense or damage over time or other sorts of things here. But I think we actually went over. I think we went too much on cast speed because it made too much of our damage reliant on standing still and casting, which of course at the peak bosses like during the Harbingers or 1,000 Corruption when you need to move around and avoid them, or during Abroth you got to move around and avoid stuff. Having to hold down and take advantage of your cast speed kind of felt like it was inconsistent damage. So you can play around with that yourself, but I knew I wanted to do something with cast speed, so I just grabbed some tier 7 cast speed here. Idols, kind of boring. You'd like to have hybrid health everywhere. Hybrid health makes your Twisted Heart better. It makes your Wall of Nothing better. It makes all of your defenses better, which you don't really have. So you'd like to have as much health as possible. I used a couple 2x1s in order to get Fizz Res, Void Res, Fizz Res, Fizz Res to round those out for my particular character here. For our blessings, we'll take a look at this view. Remember, you can change your blessings, which is a godsend from EHG. So thank you so much, Judd. Thanks for putting that in the game. We are double ailments, so we're Ignite and Bleed over here. We are not using any... Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say we're not using any Lightning Shred. We are. Of course we're using Lightning Shred. So we have Lightning Shred over here. Awesome. Love it. We have Block Chance on this blessing here. If you weren't using a shield, I would just go for % armor instead. And then, of course, we have flat armor, like always, on our Spirits of Fire blessing there. So that about does it for the character. This was a good exploration of like damage output, offenses, defenses, the play style of relying on cast speed, trying to incorporate a Polaris sword when like Electrify just doesn't have much support. So if you're not using an Aurelius, you're almost not playing an Electrify build at that point. But it's been really fun to explore like new unique items, Twisted Heart with Leech, with Wall of Nothing, with Seed of Yggdrasil. We made one of these for Smite. We made one of these for Rive as well. Like I've got other stuff that I want to try out. But right now, this build's been pretty mid. I just put up a video previous to this. If you're watching all the way to the end, make sure you jump over to that video as well. The video was called Do You Have Enough DPS? And it's actually just this character dual wielding with, peak 1 mil DPS, on the dummy ticks. Like, how does that build perform against Aberoth? And the answer is, it doesn't deal enough damage. It doesn't quite push through from this phase to this phase. It doesn't quite push the boss over at the very end of the fight. It doesn't have a kill threshold built into it unless you're weapon swapping something. Like, it just doesn't quite do enough all by itself. And not only that, but we were dual wielding, which means you have like negative defense, because for some reason when you dual wield, you take % increased damage, which is just super brutal. We're gonna go play some more Paladin builds. I've got an idea of what I want to do next, but I don't really recommend a Smite Electrify thing like this. If you have other Electrify builds that you're working on, especially melee Electrify, Forge Guards, Void Knights, Sentinels, if you're working on something with Electrify, frankly, I would be interested in knowing, not only because of my own interest, but I know that there are people out there in Twitch chat and in the world of Discord who are also interested in Electrify. So if you got something, especially if it's spicy, let me know.